Today, I'm really excited to have Jeff Reedy, who is co-founder and CEO of Scale Computing in Indianapolis, Indiana. And he is a serial entrepreneur, technologist, and a citizen of flyover country. So you're a perfect guest for us, Jeff. And just raised a not inconsiderable amount of money from VCs, I think Morgan Stanley, maybe.
Yeah, that's right.
So congratulations on that. Anytime
Thanks.
any of us raises a dime, it's worth celebration. I think you guys raised $50 million. So the first thing I want to do is have you explain to me and our audience a little bit about what you do and the technologies behind HCI, and touch on maybe some of the, since we're in these interesting economic times right now, touch on some of the cost savings and why this might be an appealing solution for some companies right now.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Really appreciate it. I think to really boil it down, I mean, the area that scale computing plays in is what's now referred to as edge computing, and
Right.
Edge computing is a marketing term, right? That means outside the data center. Much like the cloud is a marketing term that means somebody else's data center, right? So
Right.
you can only run an app either in a data center or not, right?
Right.
And so what we're talking about here is the or not, right? So you could think of, systems that are running critical applications that might be in the back of a grocery store, it might be on a factory floor, it could be on board a truck or an ocean going ship or things like this, right? Clearly not the data center, yet we all know there's tons of data being collected. There's cameras and sensors and, all sorts of things that happen
Right.
out in the world, and the cloud is not always the right solution, right? I mean, if you,
Sure.
to use a silly joke, right? If you were driving a Tesla here in Indianapolis and a deer ran out in front of the car, you don't want the Tesla asking the data center in San Francisco, what is that and do I need to stop? Right.
Right. Yeah.
And so, and there's actually, right, it's funny to think about, and it's sort of intuitively obvious, but there's actually a physics problem there, which is even if I were magically connected with a fiber optic cable to that car, that data center's 2,000 miles away, and that 4,000 mile round trip is going to take 20 milliseconds at the
speed of light. Yeah. Right.
And if you're going 70 miles an hour, well, you went 5 feet, you already hit the deer, right? So you need the only solution is to make those decisions local, or closer to at least where the data is being generated. And that's, Scale is a platform designed to do that. Now, the challenge of being outside the data center is that the resources one expects in a data center aren't necessarily there, right? So things like reliable internet, reliable power, human resources, right? IT people with screwdrivers, right? They're not in the back of the truck, right? And so, the nature of our system is to use automation and AI to detect and correct the problems that happen in IT infrastructure, the kind of stuff that your IT team would normally fix manually, we'll fix on our own, and then be able to run in on non-traditional platforms, little tiny devices like this one I keep on my desk here, right? This is a little server,
Really?
Right? You can run, hundreds of applications on this thing. Works very well if I had to tuck this under a counter in a store or up in the ceiling or something, right? You can't have a server that sounds like a jet engine in the back of a coffee shop, right? That doesn't work.
Kind of kills the ambience.
Yeah, so it's really about, keeping applications running and providing tools that allow for management in a highly distributed environment, because the nature of edge computing is, what I think of as the inverted problem from the data center. So in a traditional data center, a company may have, one data center, two data centers, one data center in a cloud, something like that. And, hundreds or thousands of applications running at that one spot, right? At the edge, you're often talking about hundreds or thousands of locations, maybe with a couple of applications running at each one, right? And so now, in that legacy data center, if it were, we were having a meeting in the morning and, there's a list of to-dos for the day. If one of those tasks takes a minute, we would just do it. And you wouldn't even bother logging it, or you probably do it during the meeting, right? It would be trivial.
Yeah.
If I have to perform that 60-second task 8,000 times, I'm putting out a proposal, right, for help. So really, addressing that kind of scale, which is very different than the data center, is really what we do. And the edge computing, as we're now calling it, is really just the latest version of distributed computing. And IT has oscillated between centralized computing and distributed computing every 20 years since it started, right?
Sure, right.
Mainframes, the client servers,
mainframes to minis, and
then to the data center, right, and the cloud, and now here we go back the other way because the bottlenecks move around, right? And so now we're, my hypothesis is we're in year 2 of the next 20-year cycle toward distributed computing, and if you or I were talking to somebody 20 years from now, they're going to call centralized computing something else, right? So, but right now that's where we are, and we're dealing with those kinds of problems.
Well, I mean, I hear a lot about, I think your hypothesis is right? I mean, we're hearing more and more discussion about edge computing and hyperconvergence and these issues. But it's not necessarily a great solution for every kind of business, right? There's some businesses where it's more appropriate. And what would those be? Businesses with lots and lots of branches that are exchanging data in real time?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly, that's a logical use case. It's really, we find that it's anywhere that you're actually going to need to run servers of some kind locally, right? And that's a ambiguous word, right? Because local, like I said, the back of the grocery store, easy to visualize, but likewise, we see many in, manufacturing and industrial type of sectors where you run effectively old school server rooms on site, right, as opposed to the cloud. And the nature of it is they often have requirements that if I've seen some of these things, right? If civil unrest broke out around the factory needs to continue to run,
keep going, right? Yeah.
And like I said, when I talk about like an oil tanker, it's, as you might imagine, offline 80% of the time. Right. There's no IT guy sitting around waiting for something to break on board the ship, right? And so you've got those, but we do a lot in retail, but also think of what I would just call the retail version of almost any business, like meaning there's a distributed nature of it. So we did a large deal earlier this year with a company in medical imaging. So your local strip mall has a center, XYZ imaging center that has an MRI machine and X-ray machines and so forth, right? So, they have hundreds of these things or thousands of these things scattered around. There's no IT person on site, yet, believe me, there's a lot of critical data and critical applications running right there, right?
And it's a lot of data. My daughter happens to be in imaging, and there's this revolution happening in imaging with AI, right? I mean, It's so much faster and more accurate, but the bottleneck is it's a ton of data that they've got to move around, and it has to be secure.
And most of these places have the equivalent of their local Comcast cable modem connection to the internet, right? I mean, and sometimes worse, right? Oftentimes strip malls and traditional malls, you get the internet from the landlord, right? And it's shared across that whole place, right? So imagine you're in a mall, there's an imaging center in the mall, and all 100 stores in the mall are sharing a 100 megabit connection, right? Like, so
doesn't work. Yeah.
Oh, and of course, if you put a ping on a connection like that, a home connection, right, it goes offline 7 times a day, right? Maybe for 5 seconds, sometimes for more, unfortunately, right? But if you're if this were a something running video cameras, and that critical video footage that you needed was the 5 seconds that you missed, right? That's real bad, right? So these kinds of things are going to run local. And we often find in IT, and I think this is one area that maybe the Midwest thing is easier for me to talk about it than some of my Silicon Valley brethren, right? But the nature of IT, there is a very blue collar element to IT, right? Meaning that,
Totally.
you
It's a
have.
DIY kind of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. You have a budget, you have to accomplish certain things, and there's certain things you're going to have to accomplish basically with not much budget, right? And that means you're going to have applications that are brand new and shiny, and they're Kubernetes, containerized, yada, 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 cool applications running right next to some app that hasn't been updated in 38 years, right? But it's
Yep.
still running something important. And you need a platform that's going to run all that stuff, right? Not just the new cool stuff, right? That's what Silicon Valley likes to talk about. And certainly I like to talk about it too. But there is an element. I mean, one of my customers, it's a small grocery store chain in Ohio, right? And they have some cool new applications, and they run a point of sale system that's 20 plus years old, running on Windows something or other, right? I mean, it's just, it's a long way from, this magic modern, infrastructure. And so having something that addresses all of these needs is really important, particularly when, again, you move outside the data center and now you don't have the IT staff standing there with a screwdriver ready to jump in and perform surgery anytime something goes wrong with the server. Right.
Right. Well, and you've been in this space for a while, right? I mean, you're a serial entrepreneur, and it looks like, except for this little brewery thing, been in technology
Yeah.
most of your life. So tell me a little bit about being an entrepreneur and that journey that you've been on.
Yeah, I mean, so I have been an entrepreneur since certainly before I either knew the word or could spell it. My bio says I started my first company when I was 11, which was
Right.
mowing lawns. So that's my other non-tech business is mowing lawns. But when I was in fourth or fifth grade, I started building PCs for people, and then when I got to high school, I was running a little consulting business where I was installing very primitive networks at local businesses, Landtastic networks.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Ironically, my chief revenue officer today was the head of sales for Artisoft, which owned Landtastic at the time. And I was one of his resellers when I was like 14, which he knows that now, but he didn't know it at the time. And that's right. And so that I've been doing this forever. Right. And when I went to college, I knew I wanted to start a business, even though I didn't know what it was. Right. So sometimes, right, entrepreneurs, they have the bright idea and they charge down that idea, and that becomes the great business. I came at it from the other side, right? I was going to have a business, and
had to figure out.
I'll figure it out later, right?
Right.
And then I was fortunate at college. I met a couple other guys like me who had the same thought, and that's what we did. So we started a couple of businesses while we were in college, and then when it came to graduation, maybe much to my own father's dismay, I didn't interview. It took no job interviews because I was going to start something, right? I didn't want the temptation of, a salary or something like that. So
we have similar stories.
Yeah. And I've been doing it ever since, right? So, I've done multiple venture capital backed companies. I've done multiple companies that were just angel investors or bootstrapped entirely. Scale has certainly been my longest venture, right? I have been the head running Scale for going on 14 years, which is multiple lifetimes in IT, right? So,
well, and I think that's one of the reasons why entrepreneurs are attracted to technology, because we're a little ADD, or at least I'll speak for myself, and tend to get bored easily. But in tech, there's no time to get bored. There's something changing all the time, and it's usually kind of fascinating, right?
Yeah, I mean, even in Scale, we just spent 10 minutes talking about edge computing, and that's new, right? I mean, edge computing has been a term only for a couple of years, and while I was certainly deploying systems that would qualify as edge computing before that, it's still fairly new, right? It's still fairly new, and having seeing our own technology evolve and grow is important. The other thing that was important when I started Scale, I had a company out of college that my co-founder Scott and I started here in Indianapolis, and that was the first company where we raised venture capital money, and that investor was from Boston, and after they didn't put this in the contract, but when we signed the funding, which was very exciting, first time.
Oh yeah, that's such a big deal, yeah.
Right? We had a cake and a party and the whole deal, right?
Yeah.
But they said, guys, you can move to Boston or you can move to San Francisco, but you can't stay in Indianapolis. And this was 1997, 6, 7, something like that, right? And so we moved to San Francisco. And then I had a couple companies there. And then when and I had some success there, and we decided to move back to the Midwest, primarily for family reasons. And then when I started Scale here, I had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, right? I'm going to build this company here because I knew I could have done it before.
Was that CMGI?
It was, yeah, it was CMGI.
Dave, so yeah, I've got a great CMGI story too, Dave Weatherall. So did you end up dealing with John Callahan?
Among many, yeah. So and certainly, I met Dave Weatherall and that whole crew. My joke. That was a crazy era of the original .com.
That was a crazy era,
right? And my joke was we were their 15th investment, so pretty early when they started investing in businesses. And then of course they basically imploded eventually, right? And so we were one of 15 left at the end. So.
It was a spectacular implosion. When we were raising money for Tech Republic, Dave Weatherall was the first guy I pitched, and he said, "I'll take the whole deal." And I was like, "This is not hard at all, right?"
Right, yeah.
But it never closed, right?
Yeah.
It just went on and on, and then they imploded, and the stock ended up being like 5% of what it had been worth. It was a crazy drop. Anyway, I knew those guys. Small world. So, and I understand that, right? Because when we were raising money, we had several VCs say, "Well, we'll invest if you move." We were in Louisville, and they're like, "We don't know anything about Louisville. We know the Derby. It's no place. You got." And we just didn't want to do that, and turn those guys down. But I understand that kind of. I'm not doing that again. Sort of.
Yeah, no, and I get it from their perspective, right? Especially, and this was an era pre-Zoom and all this kind of stuff, right? Like they had to
proximity mattered. Yeah,
and we had board meetings early on when I was 21 or whatever. We had board meetings like every month, and for them they weren't going to fly here every month, right? They had 20 other companies they had to be on boards of and this kind of thing. So I get it. But from a business standpoint, I like the Midwest, right? And I like Indiana, and I'm like, I can, I feel like I'm being helpful to the local economy, right? By doing this kind of thing here. And so I'm like, okay, well, when I started Scale, I'm going to build a literally hardcore IT infrastructure company, smack dab in the middle of the state, and here we go, right? And 14 years later, I'm still here, and part of the, part of the reason we're still here is actually because I started in Indiana, right? Like it'd be very difficult for a company like ours to grow over 14 years, and we haven't yet filed an IPO or anything in Silicon Valley because it doesn't really fit that investment model so well.
Right. That's too long a time horizon.
Yeah. Now maybe if we were out there to all having faster, that's also plausible, right? But the point is, we're going here, and when I started Scale, I knew from the very beginning that one of the things, right? Any startup, this very well, right? Any startup has to overcome a customer aversion to the unknown young company, right? The risk factor.
It's so hard. Yeah.
And I would hear so often like, well, we would go for you, but it's
go sign a big client and come back.
right. Yeah. Who's your biggest client? And I'm thinking like, well, hopefully it's you, right? But that's you go through that, and then when you're dealing with where we are, IT infrastructure, and literally when a customer adopts Scale, we run all of the other applications. We're like an operating system, right? And so it's a big deal, right, for them to do it. Now I've got 30,000 deployments, and I've got plenty of stuff to talk about. We're not as well known as VMware, but then lo and behold, we outlasted VMware. So
I was going to say yet.
Yeah, exactly. So those things get better over time. But I knew I had to build the company in such a way that it was going to be here for the long haul, right? It wasn't, and I've had companies before that are more point solutions, technical solutions that very easy for somebody to get acquired. Or if we went away, not that big a deal. I mean, I had a company before this called Corvigo. We built anti-spam when, this was early 2000s, right? Junk email was a massive problem coming out of the .com crash. And so we used AI to deal with spam. Well, I mean, if we went out of business tomorrow, the worst thing that happened is the spam came back, right? Like,
No companies are depending on you for
right. I mean,
operating
you're
on
not
a daily basis.
No one dies, right, when the spam.
Right.
And, here it's like, okay, scale goes away, and now what? But we've survived through all that, and basically outlived. When I started Scale, Sun was still a company, right? Before Oracle bought Sun, and EMC
2007. The iPhone hadn't come out yet.
These were the companies that I was being compared to, right? Like, oh well, we're going with EMC because they'll be here forever. We're going with VMware because they'll be here forever. Like, well, that's not really it's a perception, right? That's not really what happens.
Sure.
But we've survived through that. So,
well, thrived perhaps. So this is a good segue to talk a little bit about flyover country and building a business in Indianapolis and that sort of tech ecosystem. I mean, I've been very impressed with what's happened in the last decade, right? With 16 Tech and Tech Point and some of these things. And I know you've been involved in that. So talk to me a little bit about the technology ecosystems up there and the startup ecosystems in Indy. And I think a lot of people who don't live on the coast, who live on the coast and don't spend time here, don't realize how much is going on in cities like Indianapolis.
Yeah, I think that's very true, right? To give a foundation, when I talked about having this company, the company got backed by CMGI. When we set up shop, which was here in Indianapolis, coming out of college, right? 3 guys starting a company made the front page of the business section in the Indy Star, right? Yep. It wasn't even because it was the internet. I mean, it was the internet, but no one even really knew what it was at the time, right? So it was like, okay, here is 3, me in a tie, is looking like I'm 14 years old again, right? Like on the cover. Well, now, right?
But you frame that cover, man.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
It's light years beyond that, right? We have an ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem of early stage venture investors, both professional, obviously an active angel network, which is kind of where most of these cities get started. But Indy's got an ecosystem now of actual professional venture investors.
Yeah, who've raised real funds.
Funds, right? The Midwest does generally, and a very important thing, there are some major success stories, right? And that breeds additional funding, that breeds additional entrepreneurs, right? And
it brings in companies like Salesforce.
No, exactly, right? And if you look at the original, take the big, I don't know how many guys there were, guys and girls, 5, 6, 7 folks who were the very early exact target group.
Yeah.
Right. They've gone on they've had multiple companies have been successful. They're venture investors. They're doing all these sorts of things. Right. And that's a major win. And before then, we had, companies like Interactive Intelligence and Made to Manage and other things here in Indy that have worked out very well. And that helps a lot. Right. I think, I've sat in many sessions, as I'm sure you have, of Midwest or Southern cities trying to figure out how can they build some kind of tech ecosystem.
Yep.
And, it's a combination. There are intentional actions that you can take, right? And then there's an element of luck and time, right? That it just takes to build these things up. One of the things that Indiana did, what some other states have done too, which was extremely helpful, is they had this thing called the venture capital tax credit. Right, which was if you made a qualified venture investment in a startup, you got a 20% tax credit. Right, so you put in $10,000, you got a $2,000 off your taxes. I mean, it was like your worst case scenario for that investment is you still got 20% of your money back. Right.
Right.
And that spurred a lot of very small investments, but so often that's all it takes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that program be really successful over the years. Then the state, had various economic development incentives and created their own venture fund, right? Elevate Ventures, which is here in
Elevate's
Indy.
really great, right?
Yeah, is right out of economic development, and they do a lot of matching, right? So one of the challenges, and this is still a challenge in the Midwest generally, maybe not in Columbus where Drive Capital exists, but which I could tell a story about that. But for the rest of the Midwest, right, the early stage of funding has gotten better. The middle rounds of funding are still fairly difficult, right?
Yeah.
The 20, 40, $50 million, there aren't a lot of funds around here that can do that themselves.
Right.
So one of the things that Elevate Ventures does in Indiana is they'll match funds up to a certain amount, right? And so you can kind of double or at least augment the size of your funding with their help. My story about Drive Ventures. So the founder of Drive, two founders, but one of the founders of Drive is a gentleman named Mark Kwame, who was from Sequoia Capital, so big famous firm out on the West Coast.
Oh yeah.
So my anti-spam company, Corvigo, he was my partner so we were backed by Sequoia, and he was my partner, and I was in Palo Alto at the time, right? And then I moved, we sold that company. I moved back to the Midwest. And then like a year later, Mark comes in Ohio, right? And, and he brings not only a network of, it's like, that's a huge, it's a bigger deal than I think people even realize to have somebody from a firm like Sequoia decide they're coming to the Midwest because there's opportunity. Right.
Yeah.
Because then he can also attract the limited partners and the big check writers to fund him. Right. And they've just raised an enormous fund. And now I can see the path by which it, even these middle rounds of funding become much, much easier for companies here to get done. And when you combine all that with just, what we're doing now, we're, having this, a video call, and you can do board meetings this way.
Well, that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
So, I think you alluded to this before, but back in the day, literally VCs were not going to drive more than 15 or 20 minutes to a board meeting. They just weren't. And as silly as that sounds, and proximity mattered.
Yep.
And what we saw, and, we saw it all across the country with the pandemic and Zoom and everything. And now I know that Draper I think in 21 made several investments with founders they'd never met in person. And that really changes the dynamic, right? Because now all of a sudden, Midwest investments with a cheaper cost base can be done, right?
Yep.
Because we can have those board meetings and no one has to drive.
Yeah, exactly. One of the techniques and I still recommend this, right, for folks that need to meet people in person, right? But when I would see another company in Indy get funded by a VC, that VC went to the top of my next target list, because I knew if they could make one trip and do 2 board meetings, that they would, it's just a barrier you take down, right? When you're sitting in Mountain View, this isn't a problem. But when you're here, you do need to think about, again, when I did, and I was fortunate with Scale, that because I had success on the West Coast, I was able to get some early funding from,
success helps,
VCs, right? And they would make the trip. But think about it, right? They fly in. That's an entire day coming from the West Coast. Right? Yeah. They spend a day with you. They probably don't get out till the next morning. It's a huge commitment relative to them, knocking out 3 board meetings in a day. So
totally.
Just a big difference. Now, with Zoom, even now with my local investors, I do most of the board meetings on Zoom, right? It's just easier to get everybody together. People are at home. We like to get together in person still, obviously now and again, but you don't have to.
And right.
It makes a huge difference. And also for selling purposes, right? Now, most of our customers' interactions are this way.
So. Well, we couldn't have scripted this better, because one of the things I wanted to specifically talk to you about was sales. When you talked about being an entrepreneur, and you said, most people have their idea and then I'm going to start a company, right? And those are, generally, almost universally, product people. right?
Mm-hmm.
I've created, or a service. I've created this thing, and it's self-evident why it's so awesome and why everyone would buy it. All I have to do is show it to someone, right?
Yep.
And they're not salespeople generally, right? And one of the places where we see a lot of companies fail is they never developed or hired a sales force that was ready for prime time, right? And so I wanted to see if you had any comments on that, because it is a difficult thing. I mean, for any company, hiring great salespeople is a hard thing, and I think a lot of startups don't see the importance of that.
Yeah. So, I think you're touching on something that I have identified as the number one mistake that I have seen early stage startups make. Most companies, as you alluded, at least in tech, right? And maybe for everything, but certainly in tech, most companies are started by product people.
Yeah,
and people have a vision. And I'm one of those guys, right? I mean, I'm a product.
Sure, right.
You have a vision for the product, and they do two things, right? One, they convince themselves that it is the greatest thing that anyone has ever thought of.
Right.
And two, they are terrified of telling anybody about their idea because they think the world is going to
steal it. Yeah.
Right? It's a horrible mistake. Right. Because then, what happens
all about execution.
Exactly. I mean, I carry around a notebook full of business ideas, right? I'll rip a page out and mail it to anybody who wants one. Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it'd be awesome, right?
99.99% of the work is, what's coming afterwards, right? A stupid idea will tank a business for sure, but a great idea isn't going to get you anywhere, right?
No.
So they won't tell anybody. And then when they don't tell anybody, they what they think they need to do is go build that product or service in their little ivory tower.
Right.
And then once it's done, take it out and try and show it to people. And then they'll just all flock in, right?
Because everybody will love it, right?
Yeah. And what they've missed is the entire opportunity to get feedback on that product or service before you've spent all this time and effort building what's inevitably wrong. Right.
Yep.
I have a presentation I give to like college classes and community groups on entrepreneurship, and it's Jeff's 7 rules of business. But rule number 1 is that your idea sucks. Right. That's now, and the point is you just don't know how. Right. I guarantee you it sucks. Right. So I'll tell you this story from my own personal experience. Right. So at Scale Computing, when I started the company, in my little notebook, right, my business plan was compete with VMware. Right. Okay. That was it. That's what I wrote down.
Ambitious
plan
at the time.
Right. VMware had just gone public in 2000.
Yeah, they were a big deal.
Right. Had gone public. They had 98% market share. Stock was killing it. And I thought, somebody should compete with them. I wrote it down. Right. I mean, I have hundreds of ideas. I just jot these things down. Yep. And so then here's the key, right? Now I could have gone and I probably had enough of a resume. I could have raised money and hired engineers and started building this competitor, right?
Right.
But that's not what I did. My co-founders and we start calling. I literally went to VMware's website, found case studies, so I got company names, and then we called them. Right. And we're pitching them on, hey, we're thinking about starting a company. What if I could do everything VMware does and it would be 30% less expensive? That's my pitch. We haven't written a line of code. I haven't named anything. Right. I haven't filed any LLC documents. Yeah. Right. This is like literally 2 guys with a piece of paper making a couple of phone calls. And what was very interesting, right, is that they said, not that interested, and that's okay, right? I have to work on my pitch and this. And so I go back, I say, well, what if it was 50% less expensive than VMware? Not getting no takers, right?
So it's not a cost issue with these guys.
And finally, I guess, what if it was free, right? Free, no. And so now, mind blown, right? Because I'm like, okay, this is weird. And I asked, I get a guy on the phone, and he was with a law firm. He was a CIO of a law firm, and he was willing to talk to me. Right? Yeah, he's willing to talk to me. So I'm talking to him for 20 minutes and having a great conversation. He's entertaining my questions, and I ask him, well, what do you spend on VMware a year? And he's a mid-sized firm. He's like, oh, $200,000-$300,000 probably. And I
Really?
said, if I was going to give you that for free, like, this is not interesting. He's like, well, it's really only, part of the equation. I said, well, what do we have going on? He's like, well, look, I just rolled out a brand new data center, and this was pre-cloud and stuff, right? So I rolled out a brand new data center here, and they were in the West Coast, so in Palo Alto. And I said, what did that cost? He's like, $2 million.
Yeah, little sunk cost theory going on here.
Right? So now the light bulb goes off, right? What I thought I was asking him was, if I could save you 100% of your cost, would you go with an unknown startup you've never heard of? What he's hearing is, if I can save him 15%, right? Yeah. He's going to spend $2 million, 200,000, 300,000 is VMware. Would you go with an unknown startup? And of course the answer is no, right? Nobody will do that. And so I asked him, I said, oh, well, what's the most expensive part of that build out? And he said, oh, by far, it's the data storage, right? The data storage was 70% of the cost. I said, what if I could save you 30% on data storage? He said, I'd write you a check right now. I'm like, okay.
There we go.
Now we're getting there. And so, what then we did is we pivoted the business model and the plan to first launch a data storage product. And then eventually came back around, and now we do compete with VMware, right? But this is the point, right? And maybe you can say, well, I had the great idea, right, to compete with VMware. If I had just launched that, we would have had no customers and gone out of business, right?
So go out and talk to people you're not related to.
Talk to everyone, right? I tell everyone your idea. If somebody steals it, you're 1 in a million and consider yourself, unfortunate, right? But otherwise, go tell everybody about your idea, find out what's wrong with it, right? And the business plan, you don't need to sit down and write a 300-page business plan, right? Everything that you need to know will be told to you by the potential customers, right? Yeah. Then the other thing that happens is when you're done, and so the reason I know this law firm's named Fenwick and West, right? So the reason I know them very well is they became my first customer at scale. Right? Awesome. When I went back and I disappeared for 9 months, and then when I needed to start selling, well, who did I call? I called all the people that I had talked to before I wrote any code. Right. And I said, hey, remember me? And of course they remember you, because one of the more interesting calls he's probably had. Right. And so they remember you, and then you say, hey, I have that product. What do you think? Well, we'll give it a try. Right. And that's, they became the first customer. So that's just this ivory tower like mentality is a huge mistake. Right. You have to get out there and then, if you do that, and it's very uncomfortable, right? Again, I'm an introvert by nature. I like to work on the product and that kind of thing. And it's, you get out there and talk to people and make cold calls, and that's not a lot of fun, right? But you get yourself to do it. Well, guess what? Now when you have to go hire a sales team, one, you have a much deeper appreciation for what it is they need to do. Totally. 2, you can explain to them what they need to do, right? And you can just work much better, right? You understand end to end how the whole thing works and what the feedback loop is from sales and marketing to product and back again, right? It's not like, everyone organizes themselves in departments, but that's not really how it works, right? It's not, these aren't isolated things. Especially early on, right? You've got, 1 million things to do and 2.5 people and a dog to get it done.
Right.
You just have to,
and $50 in the bank. Right. No.
And just, I mean, very often I've had, companies I've seen at little software companies, even here in Indy and so forth. And at some point, I tell them, just stop developing it and try to sell it. Like, just try to sell what you've got, and you'll learn more, and often I've seen some of those companies decide this product was no good, right? And they pivoted or they shut it down. And I probably saved them years of turmoil and strife, because, they could have, an investor pain, right? Investors tend to get a little, cranky when you're not selling anything and it's not working after they've put
they're the guys that you thought were your friends.
When money's on the line, people's emotions get a little different. So
totally. One of the things that seems to be the case is that you've kept the same team or parts of the same team with you for years, which I've done too. And I feel like one of the things that's not talked about enough when we talk about entrepreneurship is the importance of the team. And I even argued that your typical founder's primary characteristics are a form of insanity, right? Because they're measuring risk on a different scale than most people. So it's not a higher tolerance for risk. It's not like, oh, we're all measuring it and I'll take the 2% chance. It's like, no, it's not 2%, 30%. You know?
Right.
So having that team around you is so important. And I found, and once you find great talent, you want to hold on to it. And it looks like you've done a similar thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think I was fortunate that some of my earliest co-founders that I'd met in college were kind of wired like I was, right? And exactly what you were talking about, right? It's logically, it doesn't make any sense to start these companies, right? Like the risk of failure it's not even that I would, I think I have a 30% risk of success or 30% chance of success, and somebody else thinks I have a 2% chance of success. I know it's a 2% chance of success, but what I'm not worried about is if it doesn't work, I'm just going to try again. Right? I'm going to buy another ticket and I'm going to try again. And that's, because it helps to not be so like hung up on the one idea, right? To think that way. Yeah. Otherwise you don't want to lose it. Right. But you're absolutely correct. Right. The team, and this is important too, right? The team that makes a successful early stage startup they're not necessarily made up of the same people who are there at later stages of the company. They can be, right? I'm a little bit of a, exception to the rule. I mean, very often founders would not be running the company 14 years later when the company's gone from one customer to 30,000, right? Like it's a thing. I happen to, and maybe it's because of just my nature of how I like all stages of the business, right? I find them all very interesting, and I like building it. But along the way, you have to make changes, and especially early on, right? You need two things, right? I'm always looking for this when in the early team, and when I added people to that team that I kind of carry with me. Right. Intelligence and emotional stability, right? Like those two things, right? It doesn't matter to me what if your background was biomechanical engineering and I need someone to sell software, I can make that work. Right. Or, hey, you were you're a finance major and now you're going to be a product manager, right? It doesn't matter, right? So long as you're smart, like all this stuff can be, you went to college to learn this stuff. You can learn anything, right?
Right.
But you have to be able to go with the flow, right? In terms of that, because things are always going to go wrong.
Always changing and always going wrong.
Always going wrong. I mean, one of my favorite kind of trials by fire we still do this is, take new people, new employees to an in-person trade show, right? Where a trade show is a live event, and anyone who's ever planned a wedding or a major party or something like that, there's always something that goes screwy.
Yeah, right.
To me, that's fun, right? Like, okay, well, we're going to drive to Walmart, we're buying a TV, we're going to hook a laptop up to it, and that's our booth, right? And off you go. And you've got to be able to not to move like that and think quickly. And now later stage in the company, right, there's an element, I've seen this, one of the transition points, and I think in my estimation, this happens in the 30 to 50 employee kind of range, right, is one of the areas where things start to change a little bit. Right, I remember I had hired an executive, very experienced guy, and was a great executive for us, but was not a very early stage startup guy, right? And he came in and he said, okay, one of the things we need to change is, as he described it, like anytime a grenade rolls into the room, all 40 employees jump on it. Right? And he's like, and we're wasting time, right? Like, we only need 2 people to jump on it. Or what? I'm like, that's a good point, right? But early on, when you got 6 people, that's exactly
you need all 6, right? Yeah, for sure.
Right. And later on, you're like, okay, we need to adopt and put some process in place and so forth. And that's an interesting transition to make. But that, that willingness to go with. I mean, look, you mentioned like investors. You learn a lot about them when things don't go well. You learn about your fellow employees and co-founders when things don't go so well
Oh
too.
yeah,
right. And that's why I've stuck with the same crew, because we've all been through it. Right. We've had
and you trust each other and you have faith in each other.
Exactly. Right. And it's a, to use a, sports cliche, which I'm always, like, well, everybody does these things, but, on a football team, like part of the, if you don't trust that the guy to your left and the guy to your right are going to do their job, right, then you can't do your job the right way because you're worried about what they're doing. And part of the startup is everyone needs to jump on the grenade. And also when the grenade's gone, go do your thing and just trust that everyone else is going to do their own thing. And I'm lucky, right, that I found a team where I can do that. And it sounds like you have as well, right?
Yeah.
I've seen many entrepreneurs who are solo entrepreneurs, right? Especially if they're successful, right? They have a very hard time with this, right? They want to control everything themselves. And micromanage everything, and it might work great for them, but it doesn't scale well, right?
Right. Well, it's interesting because I mean, what you and I are talking about is something that we've found is super important to both organizations and to cities, which is, and back to your football, and I use this a lot too, is the best people, the number one thing that attracts people to a company or to a team or even to a city is, will I be working with other great performers, right? And I always am like, yeah, running back knows that he is not going to be a top 10 running back without a top 10 right tackle. Just not going to happen, right? And I'll give up some of my salary cap money so that you guys can go, right, sign one. And so the challenge is for companies to build a culture where they're saying, yeah, we are hiring great people that you can trust. And then for cities to start to believe that they've actually got world-class people doing world-class things there. Because if we get back to flyover country, right, it's amazing. And you probably had this happen, both raising money and in exits, which is the people on the coast come to you and they're like, wow, we're really, you've got a great team. We didn't really, and what they're saying is we didn't expect people to be this talented here in Indianapolis, right? Your CFO's the best, she's the best we've ever worked with. And you're like, yeah. And, this idea of letting people know that, yeah, we as a company are hiring great right tackles. And as a city, we got a talent pool of great people, because I want to know if I'm moving to a city, what's my second job, right? Is there an ecosystem? Are there other top performers here? And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but it's an interesting challenge.
I mean, first I'll say, I mean, you're absolutely correct, right? It's surprising. I won't name the VC, but it was a coastal brand name VC years ago, and I was at a board dinner. We had a board dinner before our board meeting, and I was out of the room, and I came back into the room, and I overheard this investor talking to one of my local Indiana investors. And he made the comment, he's like, I wish that this management team ran all of our companies, right? And and part of it, what he was getting at, I think, right, was we're very matter of fact, right? Like things are not going well. I didn't know any better, right? I just tell them things aren't going well, or just how it is. And that's, that isn't how oftentimes culturally, right? I think it's different when you're not in the Midwest, right? In terms of how these things work.
Very different.
This roll up your sleeves and just get it done mentality, right, is cultural. So that's a thing, right? And you're absolutely correct, right? Attracting the most difficult positions I have found to attract to the Midwest are, it's not the entry level and lower level positions, because we now have quite an ecosystem, right? Again, there's a lot of companies, people get experienced, we have great universities, all this kind of stuff. It's higher up in management because of what you mentioned. If I relocate somebody from San Francisco to Indy and it doesn't work out, right? It's a big move. They move their family, they're
Oh yeah,
committed,
it's huge.
right? And so this is where, again, having some successes helps and time helps. That said, this is also where, now, I have executives who don't live in any of these. They don't live in Indy. They don't live in San Francisco. They live in
Right,
Idaho or
Boise,
Florida or whatever.
exactly.
You're managing it all this way. And that, that's helpful, right? Probably not at all practical, 30 years ago, but certainly can work out just fine now. So, I try to leverage, all of this in the best way that I can. It's usually right in Indy, the like Tech Point here in Indy has a program specifically to attract, basically call them Indiana expats, right? So people from Indiana that move,
right, that's huge, yeah.
Right, and now became experienced, and now we're trying to pull them back, and hopefully they got family ties or something else. They just liked it, right? Whatever it might be, bring them back. And I've seen them, right? They are surprised. Like there's a lot going on here, right? They literally don't need to be so worried that if the one company doesn't work out, that they cannot find a job.
Right. No, there's a ton of people who've left. I mean, one of the challenges with Flyover Country, right, is we're exporting our best talent every year, right?
Yeah.
The top graduates at Michigan and Carnegie Mellon and Purdue. And a lot of them now, 20 years later, 10 years later, are really kind of looking for an excuse to move back, right? That because of family ties and stuff. And I think it does come down to convincing them that world-class companies are doing amazing things that are funded, and there's a talent pool and there is a second job, all those things. And once you can explain that to them, the people that already have ties there, it's fantastic, right?
And you can fortunately now within the last 5 years or so, right, there's been some national recognition for certain cities, right, that are like doing well. I mean, sort of like everyone knows Nashville's doing really well right now, right? Like it's just, you drive through Nashville and you can't.
And Austin, right? Yeah.
Right. But that's a big deal, right? For some, if somebody who's in Los Angeles who like never sets foot anywhere between here, there in New York, right? Wouldn't know, but now they know. And so it's just sort of in there, it's marketing, right? In their head, they're like, oh, well, I've heard things are okay in Nashville. Guess what? Things are pretty good in Indy. Things are pretty good in Columbus, right? Yep. I mean, even Chicago has stuff going, which I mean, Chicago's a big city, obviously, but as you well know, I'm sure, like Chicago was like not a startup friendly place at all for a long time, right? And even now they've got some interesting stuff going on. So
a bunch of cities have, and I think this is the key, have very consciously, right, through innovation districts and other initiatives, pool together critical mass of people to fund and support and help grow these ecosystems. And it's kind of to your point, right? If you're in a mid-sized city, the wins that you have are a big deal, right? And when a company gets $50 million worth of funding in Indianapolis, that's significant, right? That's like, people love that. There's a real civic pride around it, right? And I think it just keeps building and building. I definitely see that in Indianapolis. And it's been kind of crazy, right? The last 10 years, how the entrepreneurial explosion has happened and that whole, structure around entrepreneurs and innovation.
Yeah. I mean, it's great, right? I feel very fortunate, right? I mean, there was a generation of entrepreneurs here before me, and who is, obviously less than there are now, but they were mentors to me and, would meet with me. And again, this happens all over the place. There's a certain Midwest culture where I think it's a little easier, right? I mean, I meet with people all the time, right? Like, hey, I just, thought maybe you could help me. I'm like, well, I'll spend an hour with you and talk about the idea, right? I like doing it, right? I'm a little bit of a glutton for punishment when it comes to the startup thing. And, I've seen, at this point, I've seen, kids who were in college when I first started like talking to them go on to have great companies and success and made a ton of money, and they're starting their second or third thing now, right? Like it's
which is really fun to do,
awesome,
right? I mean,
right? Like I love it, right? And the to me, it is an important thing. And it's in one of my kind of regular talks, but entrepreneurship is more of a lifestyle choice than it is a career path, right? Because
I've never thought of it like that, but you're right.
So my analogy is if you work at say you work at a big company, right, of some kind, and you just decide I'm going to become a professional surfer, right?
Okay.
Clearly that is a change in lifestyle, right? You're gonna have a chat with your spouse before you just pull the trigger, right?
Right.
And and I tell people being an entrepreneur is more like being a professional surfer than it is switching from I work at Eli Lilly to I work at Roche now, right? Like it's not like that.
Right. Not the same.
And so, if you're gonna go all in on it, and then once you're down that path, now you may not like it, right? And you go back, right? But if you do like it, like me, then you're like, I should tell everybody to become a professional surfer, right? And so I'm that guy, right? Like if everybody, it's like they meet somebody who's like gets way into whatever it is they do, and they tell everybody they should do it, right? I'm that guy when it comes to entrepreneurship. So I'll talk to anybody about like, hey, here's what you do, and it doesn't matter to me whether your entrepreneurship bent is tech or whether it's services or whether it's the brewery or what. It's how I got involved in the brewery. Is a couple of guys were pitching me on like starting a brewery. I think being an entrepreneur is sort of the quintessential like American thing, right? Like I know
I totally agree.
To me, it's like that's what we do, right? You should come up with ideas and try them, and hopefully they work. And
sure,
I just love it. So,
and we're gonna cross those mountains. We have no idea what's on the other side, but it should be a really interesting trip.
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of the story. Well, it's been really great talking to you. I'm excited about what you guys are doing in Indy, and I think your success helps the whole region. I think a couple of things that have come out of this for entrepreneurs is talk to people about your product or service before you polish it and get it all exactly what you think is perfect. Get mentors.
Yep.
Right. Pay a lot of attention to who you hire, especially early on. And I like your rule about, smarter than the average bear and emotionally stable. That's a tough combo. So any other final thoughts before I let you get on with the rest of the day?
I think you nailed it, right? And I'll just say this, one of my tricks, right? When you do talk to everybody that you can, right? The very last question that you ask is who do you know that I should talk to?
That's really great advice. No matter,
and then it's a pseudo warm intro, right? And it takes down that cold calling thing. And look, I know people are listening to this and they're like, oh my God, I can't do it. Like you can do it, right? I know it sucks to go out there and talk to folks. I mean, I had a company years ago that I was helping, a couple entrepreneurs, and they had an idea for it was basically a product that would be sold at like a Walgreens or a CVS, like a consumer product. And I didn't want to do it. They finally, I said, just go stand outside with a clipboard and ask people questions. Like those are your potential customers. Like, people, 9 out of 10 people are like brush you off and walk away. Yeah, but if you have one conversation with one person, it changes the direction of the product.
So you're saying there's still a chance.
The whole day, you're saying there's a chance. That's right. The whole day's been worth it. So that's the number one thing, and enjoy it. Right? I mean, it's not it is a lifestyle thing. You don't know what's on the other side of the mountains, but if you enjoy climbing the mountain, then it's for you. So
yeah, if you don't love it, it'll drive you insane, right?
Yeah,
it's well, anyway, thanks so much for joining us. And next time I get up to Indy, we'll grab a cup of coffee because that's fairly frequent. And look forward to staying in touch.
All right. Very good.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Tom.
Really appreciate it.
Yep.